The snow came quietly to Harlow County that Christmas Eve of 1887, drifting down in thin, pale curtains across the flat Texas plains like the land itself was trying to cover something shameful. It settled on fence posts that leaned without purpose, on a barn roof that sagged in the middle like a tired old man, and on the long dirt path leading to the Broken Spur Ranch, a path that nobody traveled anymore. Nobody except the woman who had no choice but to stay. Joshie Calloway stood at the front window of the ranch house, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her brown eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She was 29 years old and carried herself with the straight-backed posture of someone who had learned early that the world did not soften itself for women who showed weakness. She was beautiful in the way that hard country sometimes produces, not delicate but striking. High cheekbones, a jaw set with quiet resolve, hands that were soft once before the ranch, before the grief, before everything. She pressed one palm flat against the cold glass and watched the snow fall. 6 months. It had been 6 months since she buried her father, Harlow Calloway, beneath the old oak at the edge of the south pasture. 6 months since she had taken over a ranch that was already bleeding. The cattle, what remained of them, had been rustled 3 weeks after the funeral. 43 head vanished overnight like smoke. Her 2 ranch hands, Pete and old Ramai, had ridden out the following morning with their hats in their hands and apologies they couldn't quite finish. She hadn't blamed them. She had no money to pay them. She had no money for much of anything. The letter from Harlow Creek Savings and Loan sat on the kitchen table where it had sat for 11 days. She had stopped turning it face down. There was no point pretending it wasn't there. $1,200 outstanding. Payment due January 1st, 1888. Failure to remit will result in immediate foreclosure proceedings. Signed in the sharp, slanted handwriting of Mr. Vance Aldridge, a man who wore pressed suits in a town full of dusty boots, who smiled with his mouth but never with his eyes, and who had been circling the Broken Spur like a buzzard since before her father's body was cold in the ground. Joshie turned from the window. The ranch house was dim, lit only by the low amber glow of the fireplace. It was a modest home, rough-hewn timber walls, a cast-iron stove in the kitchen, a braided rug her mother had made before Joshie was old enough to remember her. Photographs on the mantel, a rifle above the door, the smell of pine smoke and old leather and something that used to mean safety. On the hook beside the front door hung her father's Christmas wreath, dried cedar branches tied with a faded red ribbon, a little more ragged each year, but always there. Harlow Calloway had hung it every single Christmas Eve without fail, even the year the drought nearly broke them, even the year Joshie's mother passed. As long as there's a wreath on the door, he used to say, the Calloways are still standing. Joshie crossed the room, lifted the wreath from its hook and set it down on the table beside the bank letter. She couldn't explain exactly why, only that it felt dishonest to hang it this year. She sat down in her father's chair by the fire, the old rocker with the worn armrests, and pulled his Bible from the side table. She didn't open it. She just held it in both hands, the leather cool against her fingers, its weight both comforting and unbearable. The firelight shifted. Outside, the wind moved low across the plains with a sound like a held breath. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. The words surprised her. She hadn't meant to say them aloud. She looked around the empty room as though someone might have heard, but there was only the fire and the shadows, and the snow still falling past the window in silence. She set the Bible down, pressed her fingers to her eyes, and stayed very still for a long moment. Then she stood, because Joshie Calloway did not know how to stay down for long, even when every sensible part of her wanted to. She moved to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and did not let herself cry. Outside, unseen in the dark beside the barn, a fresh stack of firewood sat neatly against the wall. She didn't know it was there. She didn't know yet that someone had been watching over her, quietly, patiently, from a distance. But she would. He was already working when she found him. Joshie stepped out onto the porch on Christmas morning, boots unlaced, coat thrown over her nightgown, expecting nothing but cold air and another gray sky. Instead, she found a stranger crouched at her broken fence line, hammer in hand, driving a post into the frozen ground with calm, unhurried strokes, as though he had been doing it for years, as though it were perfectly ordinary, as though it were his fence. She was back inside and through the door with her rifle in 4 seconds flat. "Step away from that fence and put your hands where I can see them." He stopped, set the hammer down in the snow without being told, rose slowly to his full height, which was considerable, and turned around with both hands open at his sides. He was 32, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw shaded by several days of dark stubble and eyes the color of worn saddle leather. His coat was heavy canvas, his boots were cracked at the toe, and his hat, which he now removed with one steady hand, had seen more weather than most men twice his age. He did not look afraid. He did not look guilty. He looked like a man who had been expected to explain himself before and had learned to do it without flinching. "I'm not here for trouble, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind that didn't need volume to carry. "I knew your father." Her grip on the rifle did not loosen. "Everybody in Harlow County knew my father. I worked his south pasture in the summer of 1879, he said. 3 months. He paid me fair, fed me at his table, and didn't ask questions I didn't want to answer. My name is Cole Briggs. I heard Harlow passed. I came to pay my respects." He paused, glancing once at the sagging barn, the empty pasture, the leaning posts he had already begun to fix. "And it looks like I arrived useful." She watched him for a long moment. Then she lowered the rifle, not all the way, but enough. She told him she didn't need help. He nodded, picked up his hammer, and left without argument. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He never knocked. He never announced himself. He simply appeared at first light and worked the barn door rehung, the water pump unjammed, the cracked stall boards replaced with timber he seemed to produce from nowhere. He slept in the barn. He asked for nothing. When she brought him coffee on the 3rd morning, more out of guilt than gratitude, he accepted it with a single nod and went back to work. By the 4th day, she stopped pretending she wasn't watching him. It was Cole who first noticed the pattern in the cattle tracks, the ones left behind after the rustling. He crouched in the south pasture mud, studying the ground with the focused quiet of a man who had learned to read land the way others read print. The tracks weren't random. They were deliberate, organized, and they led toward the old Miller Road, which fed directly into the eastern property boundary of Harlow Creek Savings and Loan's recently acquired land holdings. "This wasn't opportunistic," Cole said quietly, standing. "Somebody planned this." He told her what he suspected carefully, without drama. Mr. Vance Aldridge had quietly purchased a stretch of land east of town 6 months prior, right around the time Joshie Calloway fell ill. A railroad company out of San Antonio had been scouting routes through the county. The Broken Spur's land sat directly along the most valuable corridor. If Aldridge could acquire it through foreclosure, the railroad deal would make him extraordinarily wealthy. The cattle hadn't been stolen by outlaws passing through. They had been stolen on order. Joshie sat with that truth for a long time without speaking. It was 3 days before New Year's when the snowstorm caught them far from the ranch, tracking the rustlers' trail through the hill country. They took shelter in an abandoned trapper's cabin as the wind turned savage outside, sharing the last of Cole's hardtack and a small fire built from broken chair legs. That was when Joshie finally stopped holding herself together. It came without warning, the way grief always does when it has been disciplined too long. Her shoulders dropped. Her breath broke. She pressed her hand over her mouth and turned toward the wall, furious at herself for crumbling in front of a man she had known less than 2 weeks. Cole didn't say anything at first. He simply moved closer, lowered himself beside her, and waited the way patient men do, without filling silence with noise. Then he bent his head toward hers, and in a voice meant only for that small, fire-lit room, he said, "You're not carrying this alone. I'm here for you." She looked at him, really looked perhaps for the first time, and something in the locked, careful architecture of her heart shifted without her permission. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, for the first time in months, Joshie Calloway did not feel alone. The storm broke by morning. They rode back through a world washed clean and white, the Texas hill country glittering under a pale winter sun as though the land itself had decided to start over. Cole rode slightly ahead, his eyes scanning the trail out of old habit. Joshie rode beside him when the path widened, and neither of them spoke much, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the quieter, warmer kind that only grows between people who have seen each other clearly and chosen not to look away. Cole had seen the ledger. 3 days prior, tracking the rustlers' camp to a ravine 6 miles east of Broken Spur, they had found it tucked inside a saddlebag hanging from a nail in an abandoned line shack. A small brown ledger, its pages filled with dates, cattle counts, dollar amounts, and initials. VA appeared on every other line. Beside the ledger sat a folded letter on the official stationery of Harlow Creek Savings and Loan, instructing the rustlers precisely which herd to take, which route to use, and promising final payment upon confirmation of foreclosure. Joshie had read it twice, her hands perfectly steady. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it inside her coat, and looked at Cole with eyes that had moved clean past grief and arrived somewhere much harder and much calmer. "New Year's Eve," she said. "We ride to town." They arrived in Harlow Creek as the last pale light of December 31st stretched long across the main street. The town was dressed for celebration, lanterns strung between posts, the saloon spilling piano music and warm light onto the snow, but Joshie rode past all of it without a glance. Cole rode beside her, steady as timber. Judge Harmon's office sat at the far end of Main Street, above the land registry. He was a stout, serious man with steel-gray whiskers who had known Joshie Calloway for 30 years and had quietly distrusted Vance Aldridge for nearly as long. He received them without appointment, listened without interruption, and read every page of the ledger and the letter with the careful attention of a man who understood exactly what he was holding. Word spread through Harlow Creek the way words always do in small towns, faster than horses, quieter than wind. By the time Aldridge was summoned to the courthouse, half the town had gathered in the street outside. He arrived composed, silver-haired, his suit pressed even on New Year's Eve. He took one look at the ledger on Judge Harmon's desk and produced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He spoke of forgeries. He spoke of desperate women and drifting cowboys with motives and grudges. He straightened his cufflinks and suggested the judge consider carefully before disrupting the legitimate business interests of a respected community institution. Cole stood at the back of the room with his arms folded and said nothing. He didn't need to. The letter, it turned out, bore a wax seal, Aldridge's personal seal, a small, distinctive emblem that matched the stamp sitting openly on the corner of his own office desk, which Judge Harmon's deputy confirmed within the hour. The ruling was swift and absolute. Aldridge's foreclosure claim was declared fraudulent. The debt against Broken Spur Ranch was dissolved. Vance Aldridge was taken into custody to await a circuit court hearing, his silver composure finally cracking as the deputy's hand closed around his arm. Joshie walked out of that courthouse into the cold New Year's Eve air, and the gathered townspeople, some who had pitied her, some who had whispered, some who had simply looked away, watched her in silence. She stood at the top of the steps and let the cold air fill her lungs. Cole appeared beside her. He didn't say anything. He simply stood there, shoulder to shoulder with her, looking out at the town that had finally looked back. They rode home beneath a sky so full of stars it seemed almost excessive, as though the night were trying to make something up to her. The Broken Spur came into view slowly, its silhouette familiar and aching and entirely hers. She went inside, picked up her father's Christmas wreath from the table where it had sat beside the bank letter all these weeks, and walked back to the front door. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were bright. She hung it on the hook where it belonged and stood looking at it for a long, full moment. Still standing, she thought. Daddy were still standing. She turned to find Cole on the porch, hat in hand, his saddlebag over one shoulder packed. Her heart dropped before she could stop it. "Where exactly do you think you're going, Cole Briggs?" she said. He looked at her with those worn saddle eyes and almost smiled. "Figured you had things handled now." I had things handled before you arrived, she said. That was never the point. He was quiet for a moment. The stars burned overhead. Somewhere across the dark pasture, a horse shifted in the barn. No, he said finally softly. I don't suppose it was. He set the saddlebag down. Spring came to Broken Spur Ranch like a long exhale. The fences held. The well ran clear and cold. 12 new cattle grazed the south pasture, purchased with a modest loan from a different bank in a different town, one without Aldridge's initials in any ledger. The barn roof was repaired. The front porch had a new board where the old one had rotted through. Wildflowers came up along the fence line in colors Joshie hadn't seen since childhood. On a warm Saturday in June, beneath a sky the color of a promise, with the townspeople of Harlow Creek gathered on the grass and Judge Harmon presiding with uncharacteristic softness, Joshie Calloway became Joshie Briggs. She wore her mother's ivory dress, taken in at the waist and let out at the hem. Cole wore a clean white shirt and his least cracked boots, and looked at her the entire time the way a man looks at something he still can't entirely believe is real. When it was done, he took her hand, and they stood together on the steps of the Broken Spur Ranch house, looking out at everything they had, which was not vast and not grand, but was entirely and completely theirs. Cole reached beside the door and hung a second wreath, fresh cedar, bright red ribbon next to her father's weathered one. 2 Calloways, he said quietly. 1 Briggs, seems right to have both up. She laughed, the real kind, the full kind, the kind she had forgotten she was capable of. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder and let herself be still. She had lost all hope that Christmas. But hope, it turned out, had arrived on horseback, quietly, steadily, with kind eyes that never looked away and a hammer in his hand at first light, fixing what was broken without being asked. And he never stopped.